They left the giant alien to die. One human's courage changed everything. I have been asked, many times, to explain what I was thinking in that moment. Officers have asked me. Journalists have asked me. A Cathari ambassador once asked me through a translator that took 40 seconds to process my answer. Every time, I give the same honest reply. I was not thinking very much at all. I just could not walk away. My name is Staff Sergeant Mara Okafor, and I have served 3 tours with the 34th Human Expeditionary Corps. I am not special. I am not unusually brave, and I am certainly not the kind of person who shows up in history files. I am 5 feet 4 inches tall. I eat too many protein bars. I talk to myself when I am nervous, which means I talk to myself almost constantly during a firefight. None of that matters to this story, but I want you to understand who was standing in that rubble before I tell you what happened next. The Battle of Varrock Station ended at 0340 hours. I know because I checked my wrist unit the moment the last signal from the Horde swarm went silent. 3 hours and 17 minutes of fighting in a pressurized transit hub, alien corridors too low for the Cathari and too wide for the Dolvari, ventilation shafts that filled with smoke and stayed that way. Human units were given what they always gave us. The ugly middle sections, the choke points, the places where size did not matter and stubbornness did. We were good at those. We had practice. After a battle, the coalition allies moved with purpose. The Cathari warriors, 9 feet of carapace and contempt, swept their casualties with efficiency. The Dolvari medics worked in coordinated silence. The Fen collected their equipment with the kind of care most species reserved for the dying. Everyone had a system. Everyone knew the protocol. The protocol, for a soldier who could not extract themselves, was simple. Mark them as a tactical loss and move on. This was not cruelty. It was mathematics. In a war against the Horde, stopping for one person risked losing 10. I understood the logic. I had been told the logic many times. The coalition briefings always included a section on this, delivered in the flat voice of someone reading a safety manual. I was walking the eastern perimeter of the station, checking on 2 of my people who had taken shrapnel near a collapsed cargo bay. I had my orders. My lieutenant had said to do a sweep of Sector 9 and report back within the hour. I was going to do exactly that. Then I heard the sound. It was deep, lower than anything a human chest can produce. It came through the floor more than through the air, like the station itself was humming in pain. I stopped walking and stood still, and I listened, and it came again. A slow, rhythmic vibration that had no place in a silent battlefield. I followed it. The corridor bent left past a collapsed support arch, and beyond it, half buried under 3 meters of station wall that had folded like paper in the pressure shock, was the largest living thing I had ever seen up close. Even broken and still, Vale Kostrath was extraordinary. His carapace, the hard outer shell that Cathari warriors grew over decades of combat, was deep blue-black with faint amber markings along the shoulder ridges. 3 of his 4 limbs were pinned under debris. The 4th was free but trembling. His chest was rising and falling, but slowly, too slowly. I stood there for a moment and simply looked at him. He looked back at me. His eyes were amber, large, without pupils in any way I recognized. They registered me. Then they moved away, toward the ceiling, toward something I could not see. It was the most complete dismissal I have ever received from another living creature. I radioed it in. My lieutenant responded in 4 seconds. He had a good radio voice, calm and clear, the voice of a man who had learned not to be surprised by anything. Leave it, Okafor. It's not our problem, and they wouldn't do it for us. He was not wrong exactly. He disconnected before I could say anything else. I stood there a little longer. The Cathari warrior's chest rose and fell. The low sound came again, from somewhere deep inside him, and I thought, that is what it sounds like when something enormous is trying very hard not to give up. I had heard that sound before, from humans. I had made that sound once, alone in a supply corridor on my 2nd tour, when I thought no one could hear me. It was a sound I recognized. I took off my pack and started looking at the debris. The problem was engineering, and I am not an engineer. I am a soldier with 3 tours of experience making things work when they should not. There is a difference, but it is smaller than most people think. I looked at the weight of the collapsed wall section, and then I looked at what I had available, and I started building a solution out of the gap between those 2 things. The cargo lines from my pack were rated for 400 kilograms. The debris weighed something close to 2 tons. The math did not work, so I changed the problem. I found a decommissioned dropship skid 40 meters down the corridor, half melted, but structurally intact along one rail. I dragged it back. I found a power cell from a wrecked coalition gun platform near the east entrance, still holding charge. I started rigging a mechanical advantage system, the kind of thing that trades force for distance, that lets one small person move something they have no right to move, because physics does not care how large you are, only how clever. Vale watched me work. He did not help. He could not. But his amber eyes tracked every movement I made, and occasionally his free limb would shift slightly, and I began to realize he was trying to communicate. He kept making a motion that I eventually understood as, stop, go away, leave. I understood it. I acknowledged it. I kept working. 2 hours passed. My fingers bled inside my gloves from where the composite edge of the debris had cut through the material. My shoulder was protesting from an angle I had held too long. I talked to myself steadily, which meant I talked to him, since he was the only other presence in that corridor. I explained what I was doing, step by step. I do not know if any of it reached him. I do not know if the translator damage was total or partial. I told him anyway, because working in silence felt wrong when something was dying nearby. I freed his lower right limb first. It was the smallest of the 4, and the debris pinning it had shifted enough that the rig could manage the weight. He moved it experimentally, testing the joint. Then he went still again, and watched me move to the next section. That was when the ceiling shifted. There was no warning sound, which is the worst kind. One moment the collapsed wall section above his upper carapace was stable. The next moment, a secondary support arch, one I had not noticed in the smoke and low light, cracked along a stress fracture and began to fold. The geometry of it was clear immediately. It was going to come down directly onto the exposed section of his chest that I had been working to clear. If it landed there, he would not survive. I had perhaps 4 seconds. I did not make a decision. Exactly. I moved. I got into the gap between the falling section and Vale's body, and I put my equipment between the structure and him, the dropship skid rail, angled, acting as a brace. I braced it with my own weight, leaning into it, my boots finding grip on the floor, because the skid alone was not going to hold without something anchoring the base. It held, for long enough. I activated the rig at full pull, and the debris rerouted along the path of least resistance, which was away from him, down and to the left, crashing into empty corridor floor with a sound that I felt in my back teeth. I became aware, in the quiet after, that I was pinned. The crossbeam of the skid had come back against my left shoulder as the load shifted, and I was wedged between it and a section of wall that had no intention of moving. I was not in danger. I was simply stuck. I told myself this very calmly, and then started working out how to get unstuck. Vale's free limb moved toward me. It was slow. Everything he did was slow, because he was running on very little, but it was deliberate. He reached the base of the crossbeam and he pushed. It was not much force by his standards. By mine, it was extraordinary. The beam shifted just enough. I pulled my shoulder free, and I stood up straight, and for a moment, we simply looked at each other across the rubble. I said, "Thank you." He had no way to understand the words, but he made a sound, different from the low, struggling sound from before, shorter, quieter. I do not know what it meant in Cathari. I know what it felt like. I went back to the rig, and I finished the job. It took another 40 minutes. By the time his remaining limbs were fully clear, and the debris was no longer compressing his chest, it was 0630 hours. The station was lightening with the slow gray of the external floodlights coming on for the day cycle. I sat down on a piece of rubble and ate a protein bar and watched him breathe. His breathing was better, still slow, but even. The amber markings along his shoulder had brightened slightly, which I later learned was a sign of returning blood pressure in Cathari physiology. I did not know that at the time. I just thought it was interesting that he seemed to be glowing a little. The Coalition Recovery Unit found us 20 minutes later. They were sweeping for equipment salvage, not survivors. The look on the face of the Cathari specialist when he saw Vale was unlike anything I have ever seen on an alien face. It was recognition, and beneath it, something that looked very much like disbelief. I learned later who Vale Kostrath was. line commander, third tier of Cathari military hierarchy, which meant he held strategic authority over a sector of the war that encompassed 11 star systems. The equivalent, my briefing officer told me carefully, of a general, a significant general. I had not known. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. I had not known, and I would have done exactly the same thing if he had been a common foot soldier. He was something that was suffering, in a corridor where I could hear it, and I had hands and time and enough stubbornness to be a problem. 6 weeks later, I stood in a coalition command tent in front of a council that had never learned my name and did not know my unit number without checking a file. Vale was there in a Cathari medical frame, stabilized, upright. He spoke for a long time. The translator worked at a delay, processing the formal Cathari phrasing into something a human could follow. He said, approximately, "I have fought beside warriors of 6 civilizations. I have seen courage in forms I did not expect. I have never seen this. This creature came into danger for one who did not know her, of a kind that does not honor her, in a war that does not elevate her. She did not leave. I do not have a word for this quality in my language. I am told humans call it something close to being decent." The tent was quiet for a long time after that. Someone asked me to respond. I stood there in front of more collective authority than I had ever been in a room with, and I thought about what to say, and what came out was, "I just didn't want to listen to you die." A pause. Then, because he was technically my superior officer even across species lines, "Sir," it got a small sound from somewhere in the room. I think it might have been laughter. I am still not entirely sure. The changes that followed were not dramatic. Nothing in institutional life is ever dramatic. There were new designations, new protocol revisions, new language in coalition briefing documents. Human units, for the first time, were listed as integrated support rather than auxiliary labor. It was a small thing, a beginning, the kind of change that takes years to mean something. My corporal, Reyes, asked me about it one evening, about a month after I was back on rotation. We were on watch, and it was one of those quiet hours where conversations find their own weight. He asked why I had done it. What had been going through my mind? I thought about it seriously, the way I always do when someone asks a real question. Then I said, because I could. Because no one else was going to. Because when I am very old and I look back at that moment, I want to remember that I was the kind of person who stayed. Reyes nodded slowly, then he asked, even if he would have walked past you? I looked out at the perimeter lights in the dark and considered that honestly. Vale Kostrath and his people would have walked past me. If it had been me under that debris, and him standing in that corridor, the protocol would have been clear, and he would have followed it. That was simply true, I said, especially then, because what someone else would do has never been a good enough reason for me to decide what I am going to do. If I only help people who would help me back, that is not kindness. That is a transaction. I am not interested in transactions. I am interested in being able to sleep. Reyes thought about that for a while. Then he said, that is either very wise or very strange, possibly both. I told him it was definitely both. We went back to watching the perimeter. Somewhere in the revised coalition protocols, in a margin that no one in the human core could read yet, because we did not have Cathari translation clearance at that level, there was a single notation, my name, written in Cathari script. Vale wrote it there himself, in the margin of the document that changed what humans were called in the war. I did not find out about it until much later. When I did, I sat with it for a long time. Then I ate a protein bar and went back to work.